I would say I have been very skeptical for my entire adult life and before, but I wasn't nearly skeptical enough. And this is a mind-blowing discovery because, I was skeptical enough that I would have been taken as fringe. I've never been off the fringe as far as the mainstream is concerned. But not only did I turn out to be right about the corruption of our system, the disruption of science, but the level at which it was disrupted is an order of magnitude worse than I thought.
Thank you for joining me this morning, Bret.
Great to be here and great to meet you.
So I guess we'll kick off because we were talking a little bit there about the tyranny of the UK. And I'm curious what you have seen in the news about it. I feel like because I watch a few American podcasts and it feels like there is a lot of information coming across the pond, some of it accurate, not so accurate. I'm curious as to what you've seen, as to what's happening here at the moment.
Well, let's put it this way. I'm watching a completely incoherent reaction to the idea of immigration and a clampdown on freedom of expression that I find absolutely jaw-dropping, especially in light of the fact that the crackdown seems to surround a reaction to the incoherent policy on immigration. And because we have echoes of those two things here in the States, it feels like a very familiar story. Frankly, it feels like Western civilization in its modern incarnation has been targeted by something that finds the rights of citizens to be galling and wishes to come up with excuses to eliminate those freedoms. So I'd be curious if you think I'm seeing anything that isn't actually happening, but I have so many friends in the UK, and I talk with all of them about this. I don't hear a lot of pushback on the idea that things have gotten pretty rough across the pond.
Yeah, it's a weird one being in London because London is so liberal as compared with the rest of the UK, and I don't, being in a liberal sphere myself, because I'm an actor, so I sort of live in that realm, I don't hear a lot about it. There's a few organisations, there's Big Brother Watch, which is quite good here. They talk about incoming surveillance in the UK, and they're worried about Palantir coming into the NHS. I do worry, I've got my family back in the US, I was actually in Florida with them last week. I do worry that it is slowly migrating to the US. I think part of that is to do with organizations like the Center for Countering Digital Hate. I spoke to a brilliant journalist a couple of days ago, Paul Holden. He worked with Matt Taibbi on the Twitter files. And there was a similar instance here where Labour in their last election failed to announce campaign funds to the tune of £700,000, and they used that to fund certain politicians within the organisation and basically break down their own party. It does feel like I'm always a bit hesitant to compare any issue between the UK and the US because I think the two immigration problems are different. I think the crackdown on free speech is different. But it does feel like the US is the only place at the moment that continues to have free speech. I sort of worry with what's happening in universities with free speech around Israel. That was what happened here in 2017 and 2018. Jeremy Corbyn was ousted and Keir Starmer became Prime Minister essentially over several claims around anti-Semitism which simply weren't true. It was the conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, and I see that happening in the US now. I hear about it mostly from news that I watch, but I'm curious what your experience is like, especially coming from academia and having to leave that realm for obviously different reasons, but sort of the liberal sphere taking over.
I'm not sure it really is different reasons, actually. As a scientist, I'm always looking for the simplest explanation that explains all of the evidence available. And that's a little bit of a dicey business. We could get into the philosophy of science and why the simplest explanation isn't always right. I think if we had all the evidence, it would always be right, but we never do have all the evidence, so we have to cobble together a coherent argument. But I'm experiencing a very reminiscent pattern. And as your audience probably mostly will not know, my wife and I were driven out of the college where we had very successfully and happily taught for 15 years over absolutely false accusations of racism and white supremacy. Now, that case was so spectacular that it got adjudicated in public. The protesters, none of whom I had ever met previously, the people making the accusations literally had no interaction with me whatsoever until they leveled it. But in that case, the public got to evaluate the claims, and they got to hear me talk about the reality on the campus, and it caused, I think, a lot of people to wake up to the idea that accusations were being leveled without any basis for the purpose of gaining power. The students of the college gained power over the college by leveling accusations that weren't true, and that is exactly the same pattern that we are seeing with false accusations of anti-Semitism. Now, this is confused in this case because there are real anti-Semites. At our college, there were no real white supremacists. So it was an easier case for people to understand. But in this case, you have actual anti-Semites who are being activated, and you have people who are falsely being accused of anti-Semitism for simply making observations about national policy and international relations that are rational. And once again, fear of being accused is so powerful that huge numbers of people fall in line. So I would advise you and your audience to step back a little bit from the particular case of what's taking place in England and realize that actually it's not an accident that this is happening across the West. This is a larger pattern, and the details are what is deranging people. I would also point out, you say we're having less of this here in the U.S., and you're right. The reason we have less of it is very clear to me. We have a Constitution, and the first two enumerated rights in that Constitution, the right to free speech and the right to bear arms, are what has slowed down our descent into tyranny. You can tell that that's true because you can just simply compare us to the other nations that are otherwise similar. You can compare us to Canada, you can compare us to Australia, you can compare us to the UK, and the answer is you're all ahead of us in the tyranny race because we have more rights, and they're enumerated explicitly in a document that we take to be nearly sacred. And frankly, I think you should all be wishing you had that document.
Yeah, I'm wondering, why do you think this is happening now? It seems to be mostly surrounding Israel and everything that's going on there, a little bit with Venezuela and US foreign policy. It feels like a lot of people expected the opposite under this administration. I think a lot of people are let down. I imagine you voted for Trump, and I'm curious how you feel about that. Have you changed your mind? I don't think people would have gone back and voted for Kamala Harris, but
yeah, fortunately in this case, the alternative was so ridiculous and unthinkable that even though I'm horrified by the way the Trump administration is behaving on this topic and several others, I don't feel I had another choice. At least we have a president whose name we know, who can be called in front of Congress and forced to answer questions, who could be indicted if he did things that were actually illegal. That's an advantage. What the Democrats were offering was a violation of our Constitution. They first ran a person who was literally non compos mentis, and when that wasn't going to fly with the public, they swapped in somebody who was not the choice of the party. These are clear violations of at least the spirit of our Constitution. And so if I had it to do over, I'd make the same vote. But I will tell you, I had a list of things that I wanted from this administration. And very high on that list was that we were promised no new wars. And when I heard that, I thought, the war with Iran has been brewing for decades. There's a faction that wants this war, and does not take no for an answer, and a president who would say, I'm not going to engage in that war, is highly desirable. And I can look past a lot if you're going to keep us out of an entanglement that will be ruinous for the U.S. and dangerous to the world. So I couldn't possibly be more alarmed by the fact that we have gone to war without even a credible story of why we did it, and the fact that accusations of bigotry are being used to silence anybody who is alarmed is a whole second level of disturbing.
Mm-hmm. What is your theory on, if you have one, on why we're over there? The UK's now sending what they call defensive planes over there as well. The only thing I can compare it to in my mind is I think back to, was it Jonathan Pollard, when he was in prison or in jail, I can't remember exactly, and Israel wanted him. And there's supposed, I don't know if this is true, but there are accusations that Netanyahu had tapped the White House and taken Bill Clinton's calls with Monica Lewinsky. And we might be seeing a similar thing with the Epstein files at the moment. I don't really understand why we're not getting a clear argument as to why, like you say, we're not starting war with Iran. It's been brewing for a long time and we're finally here.
Well, I will tell you, as a scientist, I wouldn't have a theory at this point. The word theory means that there is only one viable hypothesis left. What I have are hypotheses, and the leading hypothesis is that whatever the details of the present moment are, there was a plan to remake the Middle East that was promoted by Likudnik politicians in Israel and neocons in the United States. And that plan was put on hold when Iraq became a quagmire. It was unable to be pulled off the shelf because the American public was spooked by the fact of having gone into a war under false pretenses and not having been able to extract ourselves, 5,000 Americans dead, 500,000 to 1 million Iraqis dead. All of those things caused the American public to be very reluctant to engage in any new conflict that looked like it had that potential. And I think my hypothesis is that the 12-day war was maybe even intentionally used to soften up the public on the idea of war with Iran. In other words, they did a very good job of conducting an operation. None of us in the public can really evaluate how successful it actually was. We have to take their word for it. Maybe it wasn't that successful. Maybe the facility was destroyed, but the enriched uranium was rescued. But in any case, what it suggested was that this president could go in guns blazing and get a job done without dragging us into a quagmire. Now, I wasn't fooled, but I think many in the public were, because they did exactly what happened with the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War went so easily that it allowed us to get engaged in Iraq a second time, and we obviously couldn't get out. I think that pattern is repeating itself. So that's my hypothesis. Why it is desired, I think we in the public missed a very important PowerPoint presentation in which the necessity of remaking the Middle East by force was described in terms that the audience who was invited found very compelling. And we are now living out their fantasy and discovering the limitations of their understanding.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a lot of factors at play. Potential weapons industries and things, the things that have been going in particularly America for such a long time. One of the reasons I was really excited about the previous presidential campaign, was RFK. I thought he was absolutely brilliant. I think his story of being essentially destroyed from within and without by lawfare and etc. by the Democrats is horrendous. And the only news you get in the UK is that he's horrible and they make up all the stuff about him Was it something to do with a whale, and they make him sound mental? And he said, I think it was on Joe Rogan, he talked about before he was even in, he said that he wasn't sure how much he was actually going to be able to get done, because obviously powerful forces that he didn't even know what they were, would work against him. And it seems like that's sort of happening now. I wonder if it's not the same case with this, that potentially there was what does Trump call it, the swamp he wanted to get rid of, and the swamp is bigger than he or anyone else could have imagined.
Yes, well, I'm a big fan of Bobby Kennedy as well. What is said about him is preposterous. I have been dragged into the same landscape he was dragged into, and I know it pretty well. He's not crazy, and what he's trying to do is noble and profoundly important, and creates a very concentrated resistance. So you're looking at a propaganda campaign against him, and I think what he has accomplished is shocking that it would be possible. So as much as I'm disappointed that it hasn't gone farther, I believe he's working 7 days a week to get as close to fixing the system as he can, and it's slow going. So I want him to be as foot on the gas as he can be, but at the same time, I am aware that he is doing a job almost nobody could do. It's very hard when you know how bad things are in the realm of science and medicine to accept incremental improvements, right? You just want to get it all done. It's very hard to compromise. I sometimes think of him as in, the position of Oskar Schindler, where Oskar Schindler could do things that were really important, but the amount he couldn't do was obviously profound. So anyway, that's my feelings on Bobby Kennedy. As for how this relates to Trump, I do have another hypothesis, which is, he's a complicated man, to be sure. And I don't think I think his motivations are complicated, and some of them are selfish and business-oriented, and some of them are noble with an eye on being remembered well by history. And as much as I would like him to be motivated by doing what's right for the public at all moments, being remembered well by history is probably a close enough proxy that I can accept it. Somebody who's shooting for that is probably going to do the bidding of the public a lot. But what I have seen is that, it feels as if something that had plotted against him regaining power and gaining power in the first place has engineered some kind of control that he can no longer beat. He's won many battles. Obviously, the powers that did not want him in that office were ferocious. But having gained the office, I think there may have been a contingency plan. I don't know what it is, but it does feel to me like he's either been gamed by being presented information about the world that leads him into actions he wouldn't otherwise take, or that the leverage over him or the incentive structure around him is such that he is now doing the bidding of people who hate him.
Yeah, it seems quite scary because, again, during the last election cycle, it sort of felt like, certainly I grew up in Arizona, so quite a Republican sphere. It sort of felt like if the Democrats won, that it was going to be the end of democracy. And I worry for the next election cycle that whether it's Gavin Newsom or whoever they're going to put in there, that it might be the end there.
Yes, or what we learned is that it was already over. I worry about that. On the other hand, we do have people like Thomas Massie, who's currently in a ferocious battle to retain his seat in the House, who clearly is his own man. And so the reality is, I've forgotten who said it, but that, the question of how real the democracy is at this point is probably answered more real than you fear, less real than you'd hope. I do see the Democrats, and I am a Democrat lifelong. I see them as a lost cause and a particular hazard to the values on which the West is based. So it would take an awful lot for them to persuade me that it would be a reasonable thing to vote for them again. But I, for example, do not feel, I think we now know that war with Iran was going to happen either way. And whatever the Democrats say about it now, the evidence to me suggests, the neocons all became Democrats for this last election. I think they were going to get their way. And the surprising thing is that they got their way under Trump. So I don't think not going to war with Iran was on the ballot anywhere. But yeah, I fear the return of the Democrats because the descent into tyranny is faster under them. But I have no love for the Republicans because they obviously roll over at the drop of a hat.
Yeah, I was watching a video of yours recently. You were speaking with someone from the emergency services, and you were talking about COVID and people who didn't agree with it. And you were talking about basically the slow degradation into tyranny that the US is experiencing. Do you see any way out for the US in coming elections, or do you think it's a slow, 9/11 more tyranny, COVID more tyranny? I think what you said was it's not the next time it won't be vaccines and mandates, it might be something else. Do you think that's where the US is headed along with the rest of Europe and the UK?
Yes, I think we're in a race, and the race is between powers that we don't understand and can't see and the awareness of the public that we are watching a kind of democratic theater. If the public becomes aware that they are always being offered a choice at this point in history, the choice is, would you like to remain in the matrix and have your rights eroded incrementally, or would you like to confront the thing that is eroding your rights and not take no for an answer? And it seems obvious to me that that's the right thing to do. But I speak to a lot of Americans, and I understand them. And frankly, I like most of them. I think Americans are, by and large, good people with good values. And they don't understand that their government has ceased working on their behalf, and that this has happened. It's not new. This has been going on for decades. The average action of the government comes with a rationalization that suggests it's being done in the interest of the public, but it is almost always being done in the interest of somebody who has an objective that is bad for the public. So, in other words, most living Americans have lived almost entirely under malignant governance, and that has caused some of them to think governance itself is malignant, which is not the case, and it has caused others to sit still, watch the show, and accept it because the alternative is too frightening.
Do you think that the majority of the, dissenting opinions with the government, I've recently learnt the term astroturfing. Do you think it's all intentional? Do you think some of it's accidental? I know a lot of people are talking about a potential coming civil war. There was that film, Civil War, that I didn't see, and I don't think I need to. I sort of get this idea of trans people versus MAGA hat-wearing Republicans at arms with each other, and I don't fully understand because I don't live there anymore. Whether it is all intentional. You hear about China giving lots of money to American universities. I don't fully comprehend if it feels like it's a mix of intentional astroturfing as well as genuine grassroots movements.
Well, I think there are a couple ideas you need to include in your model in order to understand what's going on. I do believe that at the end of the day, there are PowerPoint presentations that we don't have access to that describe a plan. I think there's a lot of collusion involved in this. But most of the foot soldiers who are doing the bidding of what I call Goliath probably don't get a paycheck, don't realize they're working for anybody else. They think they are doing the job of citizens, processing the information at their disposal and coming to a rational conclusion, but they are being, dots are being placed in front of them and they are connecting them, and then they get rewarded for reasons they don't understand because there are lots of likes. Every issue has been dichotomized and polarized so that we are constantly being asked to choose between two teams, neither of which is presenting an accurate portrayal of the world. Anybody who attempts nuance is the enemy of both. There's kind of a secret illogical rule, or implicit illogical rule, which is if the person you're talking to disagrees in any substantial way with the portrayal you are providing, they are on the other team. So what that means is you have two teams saying phony things, and anybody who tries to figure out what the right interpretation is the enemy of both.
Yeah, it does. 100% feels like that. I feel like coming from a right-wing sphere, growing up in that, you hear a lot about this idea of the tyranny of the left and the cult behavior of the left, but I find it just as much so on the right. But I agree with your opinion that Americans are generally nice people. I think particularly in Europe, they're made fun of, called fat, stupid. The fact that, 70% or something of Americans don't have passports is constantly brought up because they don't travel. But I feel like when I speak to people, for the most part, speak to Americans, that they are generally balanced and nuanced in their ideas. Obviously, you can see people on the extremes in both spheres, and certainly in the UK and Europe as well. But it does feel like, I don't know if it's the news and social media or if it's more than that, this idea of going to extremes. It does feel like a lot of people are, as much as they can be, aware of what's going on with things like Israel and I feel like you're gonna speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are pretty much not 100%. We disagree over how to prioritize things and how to get them done, but by and large, we all want the same stuff. We want a fair system. We want your skin color not to dictate anything about your fate in the market. We want to be left alone. We want, the stuff normal people want. And the false picture that we are given causes us to see the other side as inhuman and desiring of immoral things, which, if you talk to people, that's just not what's going on at the level of the public. It's a totally false picture. So, yes, Americans, given the game is pretty simple, actually. By the time you get to the general election, all of the candidates who would do your bidding are gone. Right? The reason that Trump was so frightening was that he was actually his own man and unpredictable and uncorrallable, or so it seemed. So I think the freak out over President Trump was really about the fact that he might do the bidding of the public. Maybe not 100%, but in general. Why? Because he wants to be loved. Maybe that's his defect, his character flaw. But wanting to be loved by the American people should result in a lot of policy that's in the interest of the American people, because frankly, we've been doing other people's bidding for so long that making the system better than it is easy if you have the power. But go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about this term you've coined, which I think is brilliant, the Cartesian crisis. I love this idea that you can sort of reason out, you can sort of plot things out in terms of probability in what has occurred or what is most likely to occur. I think it's a really. I was watching a video on it of yours this morning, and it occurred to me that it almost feels like the evolution or the answer to Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent, which obviously has taken off. So many people don't know what it is because it was sort of pre-social media, and he kind of predicted that in a way. But it does feel like, whereas people might be reasonable, not enough people are logicking out what might be the most logical solution. You were talking about it specifically in terms of Charlie Kirk's assassination.
Yes. I was, as I mentioned, I was a college professor for 14 years, Heather for 15. And I spent essentially all of my time trying to figure out how to take very high potential students who were not well schooled in how to think logically and to teach them how to do it. And maybe more important than teach them how to do it, to get them to want to do it. Once a student wants a skill, teaching it to them isn't hard. Until they want it, it's impossible. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to motivate them, to convince them what I believe is true, that to be able to reason your way through difficult puzzles with incomplete evidence, that skill actually is the key to your ability to correct the trajectory of your own life, to solve your problems, whatever they are, whether they're romantic problems or economic problems or political problems. That is the key skill. And maybe we should define Cartesian crisis here. Cartesian crisis is the state of being unable to trust almost anything that you're being told. And it's named after René Descartes, of course, who famously realized that everything that he felt was a fact had come to him, or almost everything had come to him through some chain of authority. And if the chain of authority is compromised, the thing he had been told as a fact is unreliable. So he started searching for what he could establish for himself, and ultimately was driven back to just simply proving to himself that he even existed. Even that was a bit of a struggle. He rendered a proof. It's a weird proof because most proofs I could hand to somebody else and it would be true when they looked at it. But in René Descartes' case, he proved to himself that he existed, but the belief that he existed, though I'm sure it's right, is something we can't take his word for, right? Mm. So anyway, we are now in a state where we do not know what to think of virtually anything that we are being told. Everything is in question because our academies have been crippled. They now dispense lies with the same straight face that they report claims of what's discovered in a laboratory. I mean, there's not a single university in the U.S., I doubt there's one in the entire West, that their biology department declared we're sympathetic with people who have persistent gender dysphoria, but you can't change your sex. That's something that has nothing to do with humans or politics. Binary sex is something that goes back in our lineage 500 million years, long before there were people. So we are stuck. We've got biology departments that report a political conclusion that is biologically clearly wrong, as if it were true. We have medical schools that are participating in the mutilation of healthy young people on the basis of this biological fiction. So when you're at that level, when you're universities, not only are you hearing wrong things from them, but there's no dissent. Mm-hmm. That's unthinkable. Mm-hmm. Not one dissenting biology department. What on earth is going on? So we are in that state, and AI is like pouring gasoline on that fire. Mm-hmm. The fact is, you're not going to know whether an event that you've seen video of actually happened. We're currently watching a debate in the U.S. about whether Netanyahu is dead, because we're seeing lots of video of him, but the videos are, I would argue, probably intentionally detectable fakes. Now, why we would be seeing it, personally, I don't think Netanyahu's dead, but why we are seeing evidence that breaks apart on scrutiny means none of us know what to think. So anyway, if you imagine that that's the case across the board, that when the FDA says something is safe, it doesn't mean a damn thing. When we're told that the war in Iran is going brilliantly and that Iran is facing defeat in a matter of weeks, we don't know what to think. So anyway, that state is deranging. The ability not to establish anything is a critical problem for navigation, even of your own personal life. And that's where we are.
I'm wondering for you, because that's it's something certainly with my generation, I needed to sort of learn about a lot of history to understand where we are now. I've told quite a few friends recently about I can't remember which Olympics it was, but the Israeli team being assassinated live on air by Palestinians, and people are like, what? Or you talk about the Israelis at 9/11, and people are like, that happened? Or I can't remember which book I read, but it talked all about the plane hijackings that happened sort of throughout the 70s and 90s by Palestinians, and people don't realize that there's all this history. I feel like my generation is missing a lot of pieces. And then COVID was a big one as well, because once you put it in context and you understand things like the Vioxx scandal, you can start to understand that, maybe we're not being told the truth when we watch the news. I'm curious for you, were you always skeptical of certain things, say like the FDA, because that was a good example, or did you sort of come round to it?
It's a good question. I would say I have been very skeptical for my entire adult life and before, but I wasn't nearly skeptical enough. And this is a mind-blowing discovery, because, I was skeptical enough that I would have been taken as fringe. I've never been off the fringe as far as the mainstream is concerned. But not only did I turn out to be right about the corruption of our system, the disruption of science, but the level at which it was disrupted is an order of magnitude worse than I thought. And, you look at COVID. We literally had a CDC, Center for Disease Control, giving us a prescription about how to address this virus, how to prevent its spread, how to react if you contracted it. Everything they told us, everything, was the inverse of true. Not untrue. It was the inverse of true. And you don't get there by accident. I don't know why it happened. I'm still struggling to understand what the objective of any of this was. But at least the reaction to COVID was upside down. And if you even began to investigate just any piece of it to see whether that might be true, you became a pariah. Your job was threatened. Your income was taken from you. You were cast out of your friend group, sometimes even your family, over just simply trying to analyze the evidence. That is an amazing story. But I would also say, you mentioned Vioxx. Well, there are parts of my history that go back. I became a public figure in 2017 at the meltdown of the Evergreen State College. But I'd been through a couple rodeos before. One of them involved a totally accidental discovery that I made that taught me how science works, at least science where there is money at stake, like medical science. I was an evolutionary biology graduate student studying trade-offs, which I would argue trade-offs are the lens to use if you want to solve all of the major paradoxes in evolutionary biology. The paradoxes exist because we tend to think of evolution as an engine of improvement that's just constantly making creatures better, which it is. But what we don't say is there are limits to how better a creature can get that don't emerge from biology, they come from physics and chemistry. So if you start studying what evolution does when it's forced to choose between desirable characteristics, you understand a whole next level of what evolutionary biology implies. So I was studying that set of questions, and a particular one caught my attention. We had known in evolutionary biology since 1957 why creatures like us grow feeble and inefficient as we age, a process we call senescence. We knew why that happened, and it happens basically because you have a small number of genes. They do a huge number of things across a very large body composed of 30 trillion cells at any one moment if you're a human. And that means that those genes are doing more than one thing. You don't have one gene per job. You have every gene, or virtually every gene, doing multiple things. When a gene is good for you early in life, at a cost that is realized later in life, selection favors it because things that happen early in life count more towards your evolutionary success. I mean, for a number of reasons. The later it happens, the more of your reproduction that you've already done, for one thing. But for another thing, if something happens late in life, there's a pretty good chance you don't live to suffer from it. So the benefit you got early in life comes to you at a very, very low cost. So selection collects these genes that do two things, one of which is good early in life and one of which is bad late in life. And the genome should have a lot of that. But at the point I was studying this in the 90s, we hadn't found a single gene that did what we indirectly knew they must be doing. And I started to focus on something that wasn't a gene, but that had the potential to answer the question of why this has the effects on the body that it does. I was studying something called telomeres, which are repetitive genetic sequences at the ends of chromosomes, but they're not genes because they don't code for a protein, right? They never get translated into anything. And to make a long story short, our telomeres are set in their length early in development. And then for the rest of our life, they shorten every time a cell divides. And that means that growth, maintenance, and repair are all drawing on the same account. You have a limited amount of maintenance and repair and growth you can do in a lifetime, and any you do draws from that account, and the account runs dry for every cell line at some point. At the point that a cell line can no longer maintain itself, you get less good at doing the things that you're supposed to be doing as a biological organism. So we age. Now, the question was, why would selection allow such a limit? Why wouldn't it just set our capacity to maintain ourselves at infinite so that we could be young forever? And the answer turns out to be, because if it did that, we would be overrun by cancer and tumors before we ever got to reproductive age. That limit exists to rein in cell lines that just start reproducing without reason. Now, there's a reason that model, I've just described it here in a few paragraphs. There's a reason that model had not been put together before I got to it. And the reason was because there was a well-known result coming from mice that suggested that model couldn't possibly be right. And the reason was that mice have telomeres that are 5 to 10 times the length of human telomeres, even though they're a tiny fraction of our size and they live short lives. So if telomeres are reining in cancers and causing us to senesce, then why aren't mice capable of living 100 years or 500 years? Well, the mind-blowing discovery that unlocked this was that the well-reproduced result that said mice have very long telomeres was wrong, even though many labs had measured them and come up with compatible answers. What was true is that it was laboratory mice that had long telomeres, that laboratory mice had been altered by the way in which they are bred, and they all die of cancer, which we obviously don't, and they don't age in the same way that we do. They remain young, but the point is the cost of remaining young, if you're a mouse, is that you die early of cancer. So that confusing distortion in the mice causes us not to understand fairly straightforward biology. Mm-hmm. But where this gets back to Vioxx is the following thing. We don't just use those mice to study basic biological processes. We also use them to test drug safety. And what happens when you give a mouse a poison? Well, one of two things. Either the poison is so powerful that it outright kills the animal, then you'll know, hey, that's a dangerous molecule. But if it doesn't outright kill the animal, a mouse has a capacity to do something you and I don't. It can replace its tissues indefinitely. And in fact, because mice are bred in a way that causes them to all die of cancer, a poison may actually act like chemotherapy, and it may extend their lives. It may slow their cancers down because cancers are inherently vulnerable because they're constantly dividing. And when a cell is dividing and its genes are, therefore its chromosomes are separated into two single strands in order to copy them, it's very vulnerable. So the punchline of this story is we accidentally distorted the biology of laboratory mice. It misinformed us about how we function. And it specifically created an environment in which drugs that are dangerous look safe in safety testing. Mm-hmm. We release them to the public, and then we discover, oh my goodness, people are dying on the basketball court of heart failure in their 20s or 30s, and that shouldn't be happening. Mm-hmm. Well, why are they dying of heart failure? They're dying of heart failure because the heart is a tissue that has a very low capacity for repair. So damage to it is much more critical than damage to your liver, let's say. Secondly, when a young person dies of a heart attack, it catches our attention because that's not supposed to happen. So to make a long story somewhat shorter, drugs like Vioxx that are released thinking they are safe, that then go on to do heart damage. A, they're not really doing heart damage. They're doing body-wide damage, and we're noticing it in the heart. But B, that's a common pattern because those lab mice are misinforming us. And what I now know, 26 years after I was aware of that fact, is that even though I ultimately published that result, we didn't do anything to fix the mice. We're still using them. So what that told me, starting back in the very late 90s, was something is desperately wrong in the realm of science. Even where human life and limb are at risk, we do not do the rational scientific thing. And once you've seen that, it's much easier to see what happened during COVID, why we're giving statins to people for whom it has no benefit, why we're rah-rah on GLP-1 inhibitors, right? This is all par for the course. Mm-hmm. If you're new to this story, if you don't know about the mice, then you see the promising reports of one of these, whiz-bang new drugs, and you think, oh, science works. This is great. We've come up with a solution to this problem. So anyway, yeah, I've been through this before. And having seen it up close, it's much easier for me to imagine a system of incentives that causes us to engage in madness collectively, because, frankly, that happens a lot more than you'd think.
Mm-hmm. When did that come into play? When did they start altering, accidentally or intentionally, I don't know, mice for experimentation?
Well, the argument that I leveled was, so first of all, the tiny number of people who were aware of this problem immediately thought that the answer was going to be that it was the inbreeding of mice in laboratory colonies that produced this effect. And the reason that we inbreed mice is because it drives out genetic diversity, right? Mm-hmm. You get basically uniform mice. Now, They're retarded and not very functional, but they at least don't have genetic noise in their genomes.
Which you would think you would want the opposite, as humans aren't all the same. We are genetically diverse.
Yes, although, at a scientific level, to give the devil his due, at a scientific level, genetic diversity, even though it's a mirror for what we have, is the nemesis of those who are applying an analysis. The reason that we have statistics is to address the noise in our experiments that has nothing to do with the thing that we're trying to test. So in theory, a uniform genetic background is desirable in most experiments. You might want to pair it with an experiment in which you tested diverse mice. But the funny thing is, inbreeding has nothing to do, it does not elongate the telomeres. That hypothesis was falsified. The hypothesis that has not been falsified is that it is the breeding cutoff in the breeding protocols. So to make this simple, if you are a producer of laboratory mice, economically speaking, the right thing to do is to produce as many mice with as few resources as you can. And young mice produce more offspring per week than older mice. So there's a breeding cutoff, something like 8 months, where animals are retired and replaced by young animals who are breeding faster. What that does is it eliminates the role of cancer in the breeding colonies because those animals aren't old enough to be dying from it. So any value that a wild mouse would get from having cancer protection, that value doesn't show up in the colony. What does show up is animals that breed faster they come to genetically dominate the colony, those lineages that breed faster. So the point is, the more capacity for cellular replacement you have, the more evolutionary impact you have on future generations in the colony. So your question was, how long has this been going on? And the answer is something like 100 years. Now, when did it get bad? We don't know because nobody was measuring telomere lengths. But the process that initiated this evolutionary change to laboratory mice began early because those who were breeding the mice, who didn't know anything about this, simply noticed that they were more effective at doing their jobs by breeding young animals and not old ones.
Something that springs to mind just off of the back of that is not only does it not make sense to be using those mice for the telomere length, but also you hear about things like certain vaccines that are given to children, particularly in America. And I know that this has changed recently with some of the work that RFK has done. Some of the vaccines might not show any side effects until later on, until after 8 months anyway. So I watched I'll sort of add this on as well. I watched, because in researching your work, there was a video of what I'll call a takedown of you and Eric. And I'm curious as to hear your response to this. He was talking about specifically the mice and telomere length, but he was talking about the fact that he thinks it's ridiculous because in studies, and I don't know if this is true, I know it wasn't true with the vaccine for different reasons, but supposedly every drug that is studied is first tested on mice, then on monkeys or apes, and then humans. So how does that sort of scale? How does that problem with telomere scale through that study process?
Well, pharma has rigged every aspect of this. Frankly, I think mice got accidentally rigged, and pharma probably wasn't aware of it until I published my paper in 2002, at which point they realized, we need to preserve these mice at all costs because they are making drugs look safer than they are. But the particular takedown artist you're speaking of, who I have zero respect for at the level of his analytical capacity. I mean, it wasn't
a very good video.
No,
it was an hour and a half long, and it was mostly slop. I'll say that.
He's lame. But if you're one of these people who's looking to take the piss out of people, I'm sure he's satisfying. But in any case, the point is, what does he imagine actually goes on in these safety tests? What he is implying is that you have this first level of screening with the mice that may be broken, but then it would be caught in primates and then people. No. The fact is, primates are long-lived compared to mice. The mice are tested for a very short period of time. Does he imagine that these monkeys or chimps are being allowed to live out their lives in order to see whether or not their longevity has been reduced? No. Does he imagine that the number of animals being used is anything like the number of mice that are used in these experiments? No. So you're talking about a screen that has almost no capacity to detect this problem because the experiments are structured to catch only the grossest, earliest distortions. So no, that doesn't protect you at all. And the fact is, the number of drugs that have shown this pattern is very long. In fact, I've lost track. For a while, it was Seldane, it was Fen-Phen, it was Vioxx. There's a long Gleevec. There's a long list of these drugs. And at some point, I tried for more than 10 years to raise the alarm, to get somebody to pay attention. And at some point, I just gave up because it was like, imagine you're in a dream and there's a bell and you're trying to ring it and you hit the clanger against the wall and there's no noise, right? It was that. The bell wouldn't ring. So I gave up. So I'm not up to date on all of the drugs that have shown this pattern, but it's many. If it ain't this, what is it? That's the question. Why does this pattern continue to show up?
Sure. I've seen you talk a fair bit about vaccines as well. I'm fascinated. I read RFK's book. It blew my mind. I like this idea that vaccines came in around the same time as sanitation laws, I guess, in the US and the UK, and a lot of the health boons were attributed to vaccines as opposed to sanitation. And there's a lot of... The really interesting thing that I don't see anyone in Europe or the UK talking about is what RFK is doing is simply moving America to standards that we already have in Europe. I think Europe already has great standards. It's the thing of like Fruit Loops have 1,000 different ingredients in the US, but here they might have, 10. I don't eat Fruit Loops, but he's just moving to health and safety standards that we already have here. It doesn't sound that radical to me. I know there was thimerosal that was removed from most of the vaccines in America. From what I understand, it's not been removed from flu vaccines, but it's been removed from most, if not all, of childhood vaccines. I'm curious what your hypothesis is on vaccines, and are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Would we be throwing the baby out with the bathwater by eliminating all of them? Is there any need for any of them? I'm fascinated to see. I think they're still researching potential autism causes as well, which I think makes so much sense. I read, was it Gavin de Becker's book recently on vaccines, and him coming from a criminology background was fascinating. Thimerosal seems to be a main culprit. I don't know if all vaccines are a problem. I'm curious. I will stop talking now. I'm curious as to what you think.
Well, first of all, in order that people know where I'm coming from, in 2020, Heather and I published a book called A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. One of two mistakes that I believe are in that book says that vaccines are one of the three great triumphs of modern medicine, the other two being antibiotics and surgery. Neither Heather nor I believe that anymore. Now, I still believe that in principle, a vaccine could be an excellent intervention, but I now don't trust any of them based on what I've seen in terms of the quality of the research that demonstrates their safety and efficacy. I don't, even if there are vaccines on the childhood schedule that are more beneficial than they are harmful, we in the public are not in a position to know which ones they might be. So had I a child now, I would not give him a single one. Mm-hmm. Second thing I believe, and this predates the book, the best defense that a person has is a very healthy body. Now, we in the modern world do not have very healthy bodies because we are being exposed to an endless series of novel compounds and interactions with the environment for which we have no evolutionary preparedness. So, why are Americans fat? Is it because they can't figure out that they're fat and they like being that way? Or I don't know what the explanation is supposed to be. No, it has a lot to do with the advice that we've been given. We were given an upside-down food pyramid. It has a lot to do with the ingredients in our so-called food that aren't really safe for human consumption. So we've basically intervened in a complex system and created many problems that we refuse to acknowledge. But if you were to exclude all of those novel influences from the developmental environment, all of them, including screens that cause your vision to be distorted because you're looking at something this far away when most of childhood would be spent looking at things farther away, whether it's the information coming through the screen that causes you to invest your time incorrectly, to eat things you wouldn't otherwise eat, etc. All those novel influences are distorting us and making us less healthy. Were we very healthy, we would still sometimes get sick, but we would be in an excellent position to fend off most of those diseases without terribly much help. And in those rare cases where we did need some help, it would be a very finite kind of help. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned thimerosal. Thimerosal is an insane thing to have put in a vaccine in the first place. Mercury is something that medicine has often toyed with because it has profound effects on the body, but it's a Faustian bargain of the worst sort. Unfortunately, what it was replaced with was aluminum, with which you have no evolutionary history, certainly not at the level of its injection. So what I would argue is the idea of vaccination is viable, as far as I know. Safe vaccines might sometimes be the correct intervention. The cost-benefit analysis might indeed be positive. We don't have evidence to suggest that that's true in any of the cases of the current vaccines, but I'm not against vaccination in theory. I'm very much against the idea that you need many of these things, that they are the reason that diseases waned. The answer to why they waned is fascinating and much more nuanced than the story we are given. The perverse incentives around giving vaccines are preposterous, including the fact that if you can get a vaccine onto the childhood schedule, that even the adults who take it cannot sue the manufacturer if there's harm. We are simultaneously told that these things are safe and not able to sue the manufacturers if we're hurt. What sense does that make? It's obviously incoherent. So in any case, vaccines in principle, yes. Vaccines in practice, I don't trust any of them. And there are a lot of things you would want to do if you were going to administer a series of them routinely. You would want to know that the individual vaccines were net beneficial over an entire life, which is not a thing you can ascertain quickly. You would also want to know that combinations of them were safe. You would also want to know if the capacity to usefully vaccinate wanes with the number of vaccines given. You would want to know these basic questions. They're not hard to spot, but the fact is the religion of vaccines is so powerful that we are not even allowed to ask them. And, among the things that I was skeptical of, but not nearly skeptical enough, were vaccines. Mm-hmm. I never for a minute believed that they were perfectly safe. However, I assumed they had been proved net beneficial, and I certainly assumed that they had been tested against an inert placebo and shown to be tolerably safe. Neither of those things are true, and I was shocked when I discovered how low quality the research was.
From the research that you've done, is that to do with the preservatives in them, or the research on the vaccines themselves? And also, how did you come to that conclusion? How did you switch sides? Was it COVID? Because I feel like for a lot of people, for me, it was.
COVID was what alerted me that I needed to look at the assumptions that I had about the work that must have been done. Because in the case of COVID, it was a painful process of waking up, but it was pretty quick. when the vaccines were first announced, they told us two things. They're safe and they're effective. I did not initially question the claim of efficacy, but I knew immediately that the claim they were safe was a lie. And I don't mean inaccurate. I mean a deliberate lie. And the reason that I knew it was a deliberate lie was that they were based on a new technology. As a biologist, I could tell how radically different that technology was from all its predecessors. And yet we were being told that they were safe, which implies they have no long-term detrimental effects. Nobody on Earth could possibly have known that was true. Even if it turned out to be true, you couldn't in 2020 or 2021 say, this is safe. All you could say is we haven't seen any harms yet, but in truth, we don't know what happens to somebody 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road. So I knew they were lying. And as soon as I knew they were lying about safety, it became evident pretty quickly that they were also lying about efficacy and in, embarrassing ways. So at the point you've seen that happen with the COVID vaccines, it raises the question about, well, how high quality is the research with these other vaccines? And what I came to understand painfully over the course of a couple of years was that there are several technologies used in things that are vaccines or things that are called vaccines. The COVID vaccines weren't really vaccines, not in the US and not in the UK. Those were gene therapies that had been rebranded in order to get the public to accept them.
Sure. Could you explain a little bit? I do understand what you're talking about, but for listeners, could you explain why you believe that is the case? It's a gene therapy as opposed to a traditional vaccine.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a little bit sneaky because typically when you hear the term gene therapy, you think that means altering your genes, changing your genome, which is something that is very hard to do in any substantial way. And it's not how these vaccines worked, either the DNA version or the RNA version. But they're clearly gene therapies in the sense that what was given to you in the case of the RNA, the mRNA vaccines, was a genetic message packaged in a fat globule that got it taken up by your cells. And then the mRNA message would be translated into protein by your cells. It's a gene. It's not integrating into your genome, at least not by design. Evidence has emerged that it does sometimes do that, but never mind, you can put that aside. The fact that these vaccines contained a gene that was translated into protein is what makes them gene therapies. The DNA version was a little different in the sense that it wasn't packaged in a fat globule, it was packaged in a virus. But nonetheless, again, you have a genetic message being translated into spike protein. It's very straightforward. In the case of the more traditional vaccines, the ones on the childhood schedule, you have several different technologies that are used. One of them is a attenuated pathogen. That is a pathogen that is closely related to the one that we're trying to protect you from, but it has been bred in the lab to be nearly harmless. And the advantage of that is that it allows your immune system to see the enemy in a harmless form. Like imagine you were playing a war game against an army that had, less lethal rounds. Okay? So you could learn a lot on a battlefield if your enemy was shooting rubber bullets. Not perfectly safe, but maybe tolerably safe for the advantage of discovering how to do it. But in the case of an attenuated virus, you are playing with something that has the capacity to evolve and that will interact differently with each individual person. So the number of cases in which, for example, people have gotten polio from a polio vaccine is huge. You're dealing with something unpredictable because it's actually a biological entity unto itself with its own evolutionary dynamics. It can go from being harmless to being harmful. It can potentially spread to people who didn't get vaccinated. There's lots that can go wrong. Okay, so that's the basic technology and probably the best of them because it, in and of itself, because it is a real pathogen, triggers a proper immune response in the patient. But the companies don't like it because it can evolve away from them and do harm that they didn't foresee and can't prevent. So they prefer to use dead pathogens or fragments of them. Now the problem is the body, having been injected with fragments of a virus or dead viruses, does not understand itself to be sick because it isn't. And so it doesn't mount a proper response that would cause it to learn the molecular identity of the pathogen in question. So what they decided to do was add an ingredient called an adjuvant. Mm-hmm. Now, an adjuvant is really an immune irritant. Mm-hmm. It causes your immune system to hyperactivate so that it will regard the particles or dead viruses you've just dumped into it as an infection, and it will learn their identity. Now, in principle, that could work, but it's an insane thing to do because the activation of your immune system is completely nonspecific, right? So your immune system just knows that it's facing something hostile. What happens if you get a vaccine with an adjuvant? Maybe the vaccine works as intended, the immune system learns the identity of the pathogen in question, and you've picked up that immunity. But let's say it's ragweed blooming season, and there's ragweed pollen in your lungs. Well, maybe the immune system learns that the ragweed might be the thing you're sick with, and it learns to fight that. And from that year on, every time it's ragweed season, you're producing copious quantities of mucus trying to fend off this dangerous enemy that isn't actually dangerous, right? What happens if you have leaks in your gut, let's say from exposure to glyphosate, and you have eaten wheat, because we in the West tend to eat a lot of wheat. And so your immune system is seeing an awful lot of gluten, and it decides maybe that's the enemy you're sick with. And then you spend the rest of your life with a wheat allergy. What if you're in a building in which you have mold producing spores? Maybe it decides that's the enemy. So the point is, when I learned the term adjuvant, I was stunned. If somebody had told me that the vaccines that I was giving my children, or the vaccines that I myself had taken, were based on hyperactivating my immune system, I would have known that was an implausible solution to the problem, that the costs of doing that are incalculable, and that I would therefore need to know how big the benefit I was getting was. Further, I would also have known it should come with some kind of a sheet explaining how you should alter your behavior in the days, weeks, or maybe months after your injection, right? What things should you avoid eating? What should you do if, it's a season in which the conifers are putting out pollen? Maybe the vaccines should be given during months that are known to be low for all of these antigens, in addition to some advice about what not to eat. There should be some sort of a protocol. If you were going to do this safely, there would have to be something like that. And I got nothing like that. Of course not. It doesn't exist. So what I'm telling you is all of the technologies on which vaccines or so-called vaccines are based are dangerous in their own right. That does not in and of itself tell you that none of them are more beneficial than they are risky. But the fact that we are not told that there are risks and not allowed to calculate for ourselves whether, in our case, the pathogen being fended off is sufficiently well fended off and sufficiently dangerous to us that we might want to use this mechanism, none of this is discussed. It is a matter of faith that if it comes in a hypodermic needle or from a hypodermic needle, that it is all good, no harm, no cost, and all the people who say otherwise are selfish and crazy.
How do you go about? I struggle to explain these things to people. When you come across people who don't regularly read medical studies or aren't from your background, In a world saturated in misinformation, disinformation, how do you even go? Like with something like COVID particularly, it's so many years. I finally caught on. I got lucky to find Russell Brand's channel, and I saw him talking about a lot of this stuff, and that sort of was the first thing that opened my eyes to everything that was happening. But it's been years since COVID, and people don't really, unless they're aware of what really happened, they don't really care anymore. So how do you go about explaining this to an audience that might not be as well-versed as you are?
Well, the first thing is I want to talk to them about COVID, what happened, and why moving on is a very dangerous instinct. Now, mind you, I don't want to be talking about COVID anymore either. I talked about it almost nonstop for years. But I will not stop, even if I'd prefer to move on to other topics, because I know what I saw. And I also know they're not done with you. They are not done with you. They have numerous mRNA vaccines moving through the process at this very moment. They plan to replace all the vaccines we have with mRNA-based vaccines. And having gone all the way down that rabbit hole, I know that the harms which came from these things are tremendous and have very little to do with the COVID spike protein gene at their core. They are primarily about the platform. The mRNA platform has a defect in it so critical that when it is administered, it will cause the same harms, most of them at least, the same harms we've already seen, irrespective of what disease it's targeted against. And once you understand that, and once you understand that this monster not only administered untested vaccines to billions of people, but it refused to process the information that came back that says that was a terrible mistake and it did a huge amount of damage to fend off a disease that was easily managed in other ways. So having failed to notice that, one has to conclude that the system is either so deranged or so callous about causing death and destruction to people whose names they don't know that it would contemplate continuing on undeterred by the terrible result of the first mRNA vaccine campaign. So if I can get people to understand that, they're not done with you, and I'm not guessing. They are making mRNA vaccines right now at the same time they are denying the consequence of the one they've already given to billions of people. Okay? That should set off alarm bells. You should be thinking, what happens to me if I stop talking about this, stop thinking about it, don't go looking for the people who got this right? I'm going to end up facing a doctor who's going to tell me, oh, we're going to vaccinate you for RSV today. Is it safe? Oh, it's safe and highly effective and very necessary. Or your child needs this because otherwise you're risking their untimely demise facing this scary pathogen. And it's very hard for most people to stare down a doctor telling them that the right thing to do for your child is to take this vaccine, which has no downsides. But you know what? That's a sales pitch. Your doctor may or may not know that he or she has become a salesperson wielding a pitch, but that's what they are.
Yeah, I had the thought before, but I was watching something of yours the other day, and I realized there is a word for it: tick box culture with doctors, where they don't. I don't know. I'm curious if you know when that sort of happened, when doctors sort of, I guess the word is categorized, specialized, and stopped focusing, stopped reading other things, just did what they were taught in medical school and kind of moved on. When did that come into play? When was it intentional on behalf of Big Pharma, or was it accidental? And do you see any way out of it? I think there's an incredibly similar process here, but obviously it's slightly different. But I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
I don't have a date for you, but I can tell you what I think happened, and we would have to speculate as to how intentional it was. When I was a kid, doctors lived in fear of malpractice lawsuits. And let's just say their fears were rational. A doctor who did right by you might end up causing harm, and they would spend a huge amount of money defending themselves. They had to pay huge insurance premiums in order to ensure that they could preserve their practice. And it wasn't always their fault. Even if the doctor did something that killed you, it might be true that it was the rational thing to do and you got unlucky, right? So that's a frightening position for a doctor to be in. And they structured their professional lives around that hazard. It was a major consideration. Mm-hmm. The system rebuilt itself ostensibly to reduce the massive costs that came from doctors having to insure themselves and fend off these lawsuits. And those restructurings created a streamlined system in which doctors now do harm on the regular, and it does not come back to haunt them. So that means doctors do harm that was unavoidable because they did the right thing for you, but it also means harm that absolutely didn't need to happen. And the phrase that should alarm you is standard of care. The standard of care is effectively the official description of what to do with a patient who has your symptoms. Mm-hmm. And if a doctor follows the standard of care, they are essentially immune because they've done what the field has concluded the right thing to do is, and if you died, that's your problem. Mm-hmm. If they deviate from the standard of care, it doesn't matter how rational it was that they deviated, they are in danger because they have done something that the field says is not the right thing to do. So the standardization of the standard of care has caused doctors to live by a checklist, right? Do you have these symptoms? Then this is the thing we do. This is the pill we prescribe, and whatever happens to you, I'm fine. That's the doctor mindset now. And it is the inverse of what doctors were supposed to be, right? Doctors are supposed to be scientists. And that means that a doctor confronted with a patient is supposed to, with the Hippocratic Oath in mind, look at what your pattern of illness is, take a guess as to what the likely cause would be that would explain your pattern of symptoms, and apply known remedies in a manner that will allow your doctor to reverse course. If things go haywire, allow dosage to be altered to basically hone in on the correct approach to your disease.
Sure.
That's a scientific process. A doctor who is thinking, you have this symptom, and this symptom, therefore this is the pill we give you. Even that if that doctor is privately thinking, I've given that pill before and it doesn't work and it causes a bunch of side effects that are really bad. And I've given this other pill and it works pretty well. And you only need to take it for a short time and the side effects are greatly reduced. That doctor will default to the wrong medication because the doctor has not been given a choice. That's what standard of care is. So was that intentional? I would guess it's a mixture. I would guess standard of care sounds great, right? What do you want from your doctor? Well, I sure as hell want him to give me the standard of care, right? You just don't realize that when you say, I want my doctor to give me the standard of care, you're not saying, I want my doctor to care for me in the best way possible. You're saying, I want him to go check on his computer screen as to which pill that has been poorly tested for safety is supposed to be given with somebody who loosely looks like me based on a very low resolution checklist. Right? It's a crazy system. And once you know it's there, I got to tell you, I don't like going to the doctor. I don't like going to the doctor because I know too much. And that's a struggle. But, it also causes you to take an entirely different approach to your own health. I know that the right way to encounter the doctor as infrequently as possible is to figure out how to be as healthy as possible so that the number of things that trip me up enough that I have to go to the doctor is very, very low. And that's the approach people should be taking because, frankly, even though your doctor, I'm sure, went to medical school thinking, hey, that's kind of a cool career. I get to help people and get paid to do it and sleep well at night. That's the motivation to go. But the thing changes that person into somebody who is working on behalf of a set of corporations that couldn't care less if you lived or died.
That explains a lot of the villainization during COVID of things like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And was it RFK's book that sort of explained just how brilliant those two bits of medicine actually were? And you've also got the fact, I think Andrew Huberman had said that because medical information is changing all the time, something like at least 30% of what is in current medical textbooks is outdated.
Yes, it's worse than that. I think the number is higher. But first of all, and I think this is a little bit reversed between the UK and the US. In the US, the fraudulent and dangerous nature of the vaccines is understood by a fairly large population of people. But very few people understand what happened with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and they still assume that those drugs didn't work and that a bunch of us who thought they would are somehow too stupid or too petty to own up to the error we made, which is insane because, believe me, if I could say, you know what, I thought ivermectin was promising, it didn't work, I still think it was a good bet. It's too bad it was ineffective. If I could just say that and move on and never hear anybody criticize me over my support for people who were using ivermectin, that'd be great. That'd be a bargain. But I can't do it because I've actually seen the evidence. And the evidence says that ivermectin worked so well that it and hydroxychloroquine, which also worked very well, could have managed the symptoms of almost all people who were profoundly sick with COVID. Only people at the very end of their lives or who had many comorbidities might have been beyond the reach of ivermectin. And even in their case, it would have been valuable. It would have given them a better shot. So I can't in good conscience say, it didn't work. I thought it was a reasonable guess, but we'll just put it on the list of things that I got wrong. And there is a list. So, the story of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine is crazy. It happened for a reason. I think the reason has to be that from very early on, whether it was Anthony Fauci that drove this or some larger force, there was a requirement that the so-called vaccines be understood to be the savior. And if you had early on taken seriously all of the doctors who had discovered the utility of repurposed drugs, when we got around to the vaccines, people would have had no motivation to take them because they would know lots of stories of people who got very sick with COVID and then got better very rapidly because their doctor said, follow this protocol. If they had said to us, hey, there's a gene therapy that we want you to take to fend off COVID, and you could say no, and if you get COVID, you could use these drugs that work very well, and in fact, at least one of them, maybe both of them, works prophylactically. It can prevent you from getting COVID, right? Nobody would have taken some novel gene therapy that had never been applied to people if they could take, safe drugs that had been on the market for decades, one of which won a Nobel Prize. Ivermectin's, if it's not the safest drug that's ever been brought to market, it's pretty darn close to it. It's really hard to hurt yourself with it. So anyway, people have to see the bigger picture. Ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine had to be stigmatized in order to coerce people into taking the vaccines, which turned into a disaster. So That's the picture. You can speculate on why, but that's what happened.
There was a book that came out a year or two ago in the UK. It's called Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Tulleken, and it was talking about processed foods and how horrible they were for you. Interestingly enough, from a British perspective, which I really liked. I feel like when you get most of those books, they look at it from an American perspective, but I think it was important for British people to start seeing how terrible processed foods are for you. I'm curious, what do you do for your health? Do you eat meat and cheese? Are you on a carnivore diet? What sorts of things do you avoid? Glyphosate, if you can, in America? I don't even know if that's possible.
It's hard.
Yeah,
it's a good question. I will say the older I've gotten, the more ruthless I have become about policing the food I eat. And Heather and I have been careful our entire adult lives. But again, it's a question of, we were aware of the hazard of processed foods and of additives, but our skepticism was not nearly strong enough. So now I would say we certainly eat meat and cheese. The meat is all organic. It's hard to get organic cheese, but as much as we can do that, we do it. We're in favor of raw dairy. And sometimes raw cheese is available. That's cool. So all of those things, we are big fans of fermented foods, sauerkraut and kimchi especially. We have become enamored of fasting, including in the last year and a half, something called dry fasting, which sounds perfectly insane. But
I know water fasting, but I've not heard of dry fasting.
Well,
it's
dry fasting
eat nothing.
is pretty much what you'd expect. No food and no water.
Right.
And Heather and I have just a couple weeks ago finished a 3-day fast. 6 or 8 months ago, I hope I have the period right, but somewhere in the last year we did a 7-day dry fast. Amazing when you get to day 3 of a dry fast and you don't die, because we've all been told you can only go 3 days without water. Turns out that's just another thing you were told that isn't true. But anyway, it seems to have really good effects on all of the parameters that get tracked by doctors. I would say learn about it before you engage it, and don't start with a long one. Start with 24 hours, but see if it doesn't improve some things.
Yeah. What did you find? I've been curious to try it. I'm pretty skeptical, we'll say, in terms of health. We had a big thing where we cleaned out all of our coated pots and pans, moved to stainless steel. I'm now skeptical of anything powdery like detergents. We're looking into making our own stuff. I just don't trust anything anymore. I've not seen much on detergent, but I just go, it's chemicals that you're putting on your clothes. It can't be good for you.
It can't be good for you. So I agree with you. I'm skeptical of all of the things that we encounter that are novel, things that our ancestors did not encounter, and therefore we don't have a proper system for addressing them. Now, as for how serious each of these influences are, it's a little hard to gauge. You know, does it matter that your shampoo is organic? Certainly better if it is, but maybe it's not enough of a hazard that it's worth the extra cost. I can't say. But with respect to the detergents that you put on your clothes, I mean, I definitely put the washing machine on pure rinse so that more of it leaves the clothing. I use detergents that are very low in terms of their ingredient list and we've been experimenting with a brand. I will say they are a sponsor. It's not why I'm raising the issue, but it's called Branch Basics, and the idea is it is a concentrate that you buy, so it's cheaper because you're not buying a big bottle of water. You're buying a concentrate, and then you mix it to different levels for whatever you're cleaning. It has no fragrances or colors or anything like that. And so the point is it perfectly safe? I don't know, but it's as likely to be safe as anything you're going to use because the number of things in it is low, and the things in it are well known. So anyway, that pattern, we don't have any Teflon. We are big fans of cast iron. We have moved to bar soap with natural ingredients rather than liquid soaps, which aren't really soaps. They're really, in general, detergents, which are much more chemically active. So anyway, there are lots of things you can do. It's going to be a diminishing returns problem. That's really the key lesson. That one of the things I learned in studying biology and complex systems is that any system in which there is an objective and many influencing factors will show the pattern of diminishing returns. And what that means is that there are things that you should do. The lowest hanging fruit is the place to start because you get the biggest bang for your buck. As you pursue all of the novel influences in your environment, you'll get to things that are harder to replace, more expensive to swap out, that do less for you. Should you have the inside of your house painted with an oil-based paint? Probably not. You should probably use a latex paint. Why? Because the volatiles that come off it are many fewer, mostly water. Should you worry about how long it cures before you spend time in that building breathing? Probably. You might want to increase the drying time a great deal more than the manufacturer suggests. So anyway, the point is, if you think of it as diminishing returns and you stop thinking about how do I solve the problem of exposures totally, you're not going to. You can't.
Sure.
I mean, you're in a world of other people who aren't being careful. But where is the best investment, the biggest bang for my buck with respect to reducing exposures that are likely to be significantly impactful? You can do a lot.
Yeah, I was in... So being from Arizona, I was there over Christmas with my family, and at one point I knew it was going to happen and people were going to ask questions, but I've stopped buying shampoos and conditioners and things like that. And it's coconut milk and honey. Makes it very basic, and it depends on people's hairstyle. I don't recommend it for everyone, but for my long curly hair, it works quite well. My family's like, "What are you doing?" And I explained it to them. And they're like, "Why don't you just buy conditioner?" And I was like, "Well, you do absorb whatever is in the conditioner into your scalp and your hair. Would you be comfortable with eating some of your conditioner, putting it in a glass and drinking it?" And they were like, "No." And I was like, "Okay, well, it doesn't sound so ridiculous now, does it?" I'm curious, does that tie in? It must do tie into this idea of senescence. And from the basics that I can understand about it, it's the body breaking down over time. Damage to a certain part of the body only has a certain amount of repairs. If we're absorbing things like chemicals into our scalp, is that going to be affecting the senescence of organs, potentially receiving chemicals? And people talk a lot about like processed foods, and it was this ultra processed people book was talking about they'd seen rats bleeding internally from eating processed foods. So does that affect the half-life of our organs internally as well from research that you've seen?
Yes, I would say the things people should probably know are many things you wouldn't think cross the skin do. So you should be concerned about transient exposures to things. You put conditioner in your hair and then you wash it out. Doesn't feel like a profound exposure, but you don't know what that's in it is going to cross through your scalp and what damage, as you point out, might be done elsewhere in your body. And certainly, if you use the precautionary principle, and you say, I'd like to be exposed to as few things that might cross into my body as possible, and I'd like the things that I'm exposing myself to be as safe as possible if they do get inside, then that's a pretty good rule of thumb. So, precautionary principle is where it's at. But I would also go back to the issue of dry fasting, which I know strikes people as either crazy in its own right or, oh, I could never do that. And one of the reasons that I think it's so effective is that it forces the breakdown of fat. And the reason that it forces the breakdown of fat, the fact you need to know that most people will not tell you, is that the way that a camel's hump works, a camel's hump is not full of liquid water. It's full of fat. And what happens is, as the camel is starved of water, the body breaks down that fat. And chemically speaking, even though it's counterintuitive, when you break down fat molecules, you get water. So when you dry fast, your body produces water so that you do not dehydrate, and it does so by breaking down fat. Now, in our case as moderns, that's a very valuable thing to do because many molecules are fat soluble. So if you take a toxin, you don't know you're doing it, it's something in your food, something you breathed in, it may get stored in fat. And because fat is a long-term storage mechanism in the human body, it may remain there for decades. If you force the body to break down fat to make water, A, you don't lose muscle, so that's good, and B, you flush whatever toxins may be stored there so that if you then, even if you just simply put that fat back on, but you put that fat back on while you're being careful about what you eat, your exposure to toxins will be lower, and so what you're built of has less toxins in it. So anyway, I think it's a useful technique, and the discovery, I mean, it's useful psychologically too, just simply developing the willpower and frame of mind to be able to forego food and water for extended periods of time is a powerful experience.
Does the breakdown of fat when you're doing a dry fast, is that comparable to ketosis, or is that?
Oh yes, it puts you into deep ketosis. So it has if I were diagnosed with a cancer, it would be one of the first things I would try, on the basis that there's a lot of value from ketosis, and a normal diet doesn't take you there very often.
I know it massively benefited Jordan Peterson and his family when they were going through, well, I know he's still going through things at the moment, but in the past, I follow it myself as well. I moved to a carnivore diet. I was a vegetarian for 11 years, and then I just kept seeing all these videos and reading all these books about how beneficial it was for you. I think before that, I was having about 8 scoops of vegan protein a day because I started to realize that, the protein amounts they tell you need are not enough for you. And then all the stuff came out, 2 or 3 months ago, about how most protein powders, even the really expensive bougie ones, have heavy metals and all sorts of stuff in them. And I was like, okay, I don't think there's any other option but to move to a, carnivore or at least meat-based diet. How did you fare during that 7-day fast? Were you working regularly? I feel like if you're going to do something like that, you need to go to the Bahamas and just enjoy a beach. Were you at home? Were you on holiday?
Heather and I did it together. The primary motivation, Heather has some injuries from a boat accident in the Galapagos in 2016. And there was some stuff that just was not alleviated by anything. And as we started, we were initially just experimenting with water fasting. And I stumbled in trying to answer a question about water fasting. I stumbled onto this idea of dry fasting, and there was a community of people doing it, and there was a small body of literature on how it worked and how to do it correctly and all of that. And anyway, one of the things that it does is addresses chronic injury that isn't touched by anything else. So we were kind of doing it to see whether it would help Heather, which it did. But in any case, remind me what your specific question was again.
I was curious. From what I've heard, I've fasted for a day maximum myself, and I know you get a massive boost in mental activity, but I don't know how that spans over 7 days. So what were you practically doing?
So, one thing to know is that you are not in your normal mindset, and there are certain things that you might do during a normal day that you probably wouldn't want to do. I think it would be a bad idea to go for a strenuous hike because the body might not be able to keep up in terms of producing water. And so you would dehydrate. So, you need to block out time, and I wouldn't want to operate complex, heavy machinery. I don't think driving is a problem. But it did interesting things. Heather and I, because we were going through this sort of profound stress together, we're very close as it is, but it brought us even closer. It was like kind of remarkable in that regard. So we spent a lot of time in conversation, a lot of time looking out at nature and enjoying it. Early in the fast, you're very sensitive to cold because the body is not in a great position to create heat. Interestingly, later in the fast, you crave cold. And so we were doing a certain amount of cold plunging. But no, it's not a very productive time working-wise. Your brain is struggling a little bit. And there's some things you can do and some things that are difficult to do. But on the whole, we didn't go anywhere. We did talk about the fact that if we were to do it again for that period of time, it might be worth going somewhere. That'd be a good way to do it. No, we pretty much lived our lives and just took certain things off the list of activities that we would normally engage in. And, taunted each other a little bit. In the early phase, at some point, we started texting to each other pictures of really delicious-looking food. And then later, there's a point, maybe 5 days in, where your hunger vanishes. And it actually reveals that what you really want is something delightful to drink. And so anyway, we started texting each other, pictures of beverages that would be just right.
GIFs of waterfalls.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And the one last thing I'll say, since we've spent so much time on this topic, is do not make the mistake of returning to your normal diet all of a sudden at the end of a dry fast. There's a lot of work and collective experience in the community of people who does this about the refeeding process, which for the benefits of the fast to be fully realized has to be done slowly. But the benefit is, especially after a long dry fast, three days or more, every bite is kind of a revelation. Every sip of anything, including water, but any sip of anything is just like overwhelmingly good. And it's great to remind yourself of that because, we do come to take our food for granted. And even a great meal, it's like, hey, that was great. And then you're kind of on to the next thing. But when every bite is just fully enjoyed, it reminds you about how special life is, even the most basic aspects of it.
Yeah, no, there's those people who do I don't know what you call it, I guess a sight fast, where they go into a dark room with a blindfold for a week and they talk about it almost being psychedelic the first time they open their eyes after 7 days and maybe are a bit affected by the light, but I've not done anything over a long extent by that. So that's interesting. I want to segue a little bit and talk about you and Heather, because I think you guys have an amazing relationship. It's fascinating to see. It's my partner and I, we've got a good relationship as well. We talk about how many people don't, that we feel like we see, particularly we sort of stereotype, but I think there is some truth to it. The relationships between men and women, we know a lot of people who are in straight relationships. And there's the sort of stereotype of the man who needs to go out and have a lad's night, or the woman's with her friends, and they sort of part ways, maybe don't talk about certain things. I don't feel like you and Heather have that in any way, shape or form. And you have both talked recently about the importance of, I suppose, what I'll call a traditional relationship dynamic. I'm fascinated by what the right answer is. Not that I'm looking to go out and start a harem anytime soon, but I have friends who are polyamorous and they seem to be perfectly happy with that. Do you know Louis Theroux?
No.
He's a brilliant British, I guess, documentarian is how I'll describe him. He's been around since the 80s and 90s, and he became famous for interviewing everything from he famously came over to America and would spend time with white nationalists and things like that to sort of just get to know them as people. And what he does so well is if it's someone with an extremist viewpoint, he doesn't degrade them. He'll just let them speak for themselves. He came out with a recent one, and it was all about sort of the incel and, how do I want to describe this? Like the toxic masculinity movement with people like Andrew Tate. I think there's a big movement in Florida, Miami, where there's a bunch of men who will have like a podcast, and it's very, I am the man and you are the woman, and they'll subjugate them. There's so many different ways, I suppose, to go about a relationship, so many ways that are clearly wrong. But I do see a lot of people who claim to be happy in, say, a polyamorous relationship. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, if you think there's one correct way, if there can be multiple correct ways, or is everyone really who's in a, say, polyamorous relationship lying to themselves deep down, and what they want is traditional?
I think the key to being happy in a polyamorous relationship is being a guy. Am I wrong about that? Are the people you're...
No, I don't think
Okay.
so.
So,
No.
so let's just say, to be brutal about it, I think polyamory is a very comprehensible pattern that women, if they were acting in their own best interest, would shut down. And the fact that men have conned women into going along with this is sad. But it's not hard to understand why a guy might, at least for some part of his life, want to be so-called polyamorous. But no, I don't think it's good for anybody. I think it's especially insane for civilization, because the whole point of this exercise, the evolutionary exercise, is to not go extinct. And not going extinct is about producing offspring who are well-equipped for the world, and polyamory is terrible for this. So, it's a bunch of people basically goofing off using the most important machinery that exists in human beings and, going for a lark. So anyway, we can get back to that in a second. Let me just say, in terms of traditional relationships and, men oppressing women, I've tried to oppress Heather so many times, and she just is having none of it. It's really been very ineffective. So I've defaulted to an entirely different. And you said that Heather and I have a traditional relationship. And the funny thing is, there are aspects of it that are traditional, but not a lot of them. We have a very symmetrical relationship. By accident, having planned none of it, Heather and I have had the same job for almost our entire adult lives. We were college professors together. We're now podcasting together. We were grad students together. So anyway, it's a very symmetrical relationship in terms of most of the dynamics, which actually tells me something that I think people need to know. Our relationship works really, really well because we built it. We didn't import the idea of our relationship from anywhere. There would have been no place to get it. And we made plenty of mistakes. But we are both very good at detecting patterns and, I would say, prototyping and navigating. So if you're good at prototyping and navigating, you can start almost anywhere and get to somewhere good by improving your approach. And so, I'm now 57 years old, and I would say my relationship is so good that I wonder why nobody told me that that was possible. I think they didn't know. So anyway, I feel very lucky about that. But it didn't happen because I found exactly the right person. I don't think that's a real thing. I think you have to find somebody with whom you are very compatible, and then you need to sign up for the adventure of figuring out how best to become a team. And if I had understood what the objective was, if I could have taken a one-day tour through my future life, and I could have known what was possible back when I was 20, I would have gotten here much faster. Having been, I think, misled by the mythology of the times, it took a lot longer to get there because, it's like you're trying to hike out of the woods, but you don't know where you are. You don't know whether you want to go, east or south. So you stumble around looking for signs of what direction to go. So anyway, I would say we need to fix the mythology surrounding romance so that people have some idea what they're trying to accomplish and what pathway works there. If you understand that your relationship is it's like a third party, and that third party is the process, it occurs through a process of development. And then what you really want is somebody who's up to the challenge of participating in that developmental process with you, where you're going to enjoy the ride. And it's possible. I don't think it happens very often. People don't stumble on it very often. But, unfortunately, I'm kind of the wrong guy to deliver the message to young people. I think they'll take one look at me and they'll think, why would I be listening to this guy? He knows nothing of what we face. He doesn't understand who we are. And, okay, so he has a good marriage. But if I could break through that, I think there's a lot to be said about, hey, here are the things somebody should have told me, and I'm trying to do you the favor of telling you, because if you know this, if you know what you could accomplish and you know what it is that goes into accomplishing it, then it's a slam dunk. Don't you want to be happy at my age? You probably do. If that's important to you, then listen up.
Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by the mythology?
Yeah, when I was a young person, the mythology was you'll probably get married at some point. It may or may not work. The process of being married is initially kind of exciting, and then the euphoria wears off and it becomes a permanent struggle. You'll produce some kids. They could be anything. Hopefully they're good ones. You'll struggle against your biology constantly. As a guy, you are going to have to figure out how to keep the reins on your libido so it doesn't wreck your marriage. Yada, yada, yada. All those unpleasant realities. Basically, the point was, it's a chore, suck it up. Your bachelor party is us razzing you about the ridiculous thing that you've just signed up for because you're, temporarily delusional, right? Well, it's just all wrong. It's all wrong. A good marriage is possible, and if you have one, it is the most precious thing you will have. Essentially, no matter what you do, right? The thing that will make you strongest in whatever it is that you think your life mission might be is a partner who's got your back, who takes your successes and failures to heart, who can see things about you that you can't see and help you address them so that you can be stronger, more fulfilled, etc. Somebody who really, truly, deeply wants you to be happy just because it becomes a part of their mission. That is an amazing thing. And it's not terribly surprising that the boomers and the silent generation screwed up the mythology because they were so confused themselves. But at this point, we're so many generations away from a population that understood the basic meaning of what it was to live a life that, everybody who tells you that they know what it's supposed to be based on logic is making it up as they go along. I would say the only thing that might provide you a basis on which to speak authoritatively on this is just having demonstrated it. And I am not telling anybody that they can reproduce my marriage. Frankly, I think it's unlikely because both Heather and I are unusual, and we've been working on how to be good partners to each other since we were kids. But that isn't the lesson of it. The lesson of it isn't do what Bret and Heather have done. It's find somebody with whom you'd like to do your own version of that. Figure out what works for you and then get to it. And if you know that something great is possible and you pick well, don't screw that part up. You don't want to lie to yourself about somebody who's really not up to the challenge. But if you found somebody who's up to that challenge and they think you're up to that challenge, then, it is the adventure of a lifetime, and it's not a chore, even though there are lots of unpleasant aspects of it. On the whole, it's a slam dunk.
Yeah, I always compare it in my mind to the show Friends, which I really haven't seen that many episodes of. My sister loves it, but the show seems to be all about the differences between men and women. I feel like that's where it gets most of its comedy, and the men will go away and complain about the women, and the women will go away and complain about the men. And the number of times I sit in a pub or cafe with friends, and if you're with a bunch of men, they kind of sit around and complain about their partners, and I've never really understood that because I don't have anything to complain about. And like you say, it's not perfect, but the last thing I want to go and do if I'm really trying to, say, make my partner my best friend is go away and bitch about them when they're not there. That feels like that's inherently... It feels weird. It feels like someone is complaining about someone else, but actually they're doing the thing to be complained about by setting that up in the first place. I want to sort of shift this over to a more... because a question has appeared in my mind... more political viewpoint. I've heard, and I've not seen much about it, I don't know how much you know, that America is potentially in population decline. I know it's a big problem in Japan and Korea at the moment. I don't really know that much about the topic. I'm curious as to what you know about this.
Yeah, I know a few things. I mean, we are facing a decline. I think it's the result of a number of things. Arguably, there's a physiological component where fertility has dropped, sperm counts, for example. Testosterone has been reduced in men. I think there are also a huge number of cultural influences, bad mythology being one of them, where people have misunderstood the point of life, and they basically, I'm very suspicious of the concept of recreation and entertainment. I'm not saying you shouldn't be entertained, and I'm not saying you shouldn't have fun, but the idea that because something's fun, it's what you should be doing, not clear at all. So when people think the purpose of life is to sort of instantaneously experience something pleasant or joyful or exciting, and you don't understand that actually those instantaneous measures are supposed to be connected to a long-term process that actually enhances you and satisfies you and, most importantly, contributes to the world. If you don't understand that you need a kind of mission orientation to life, and that being entertained and recreating are incidental to that process, they are not the drivers of it, then you won't do the job right. So, of course, we have taken all sorts of important things and turned them into junk versions of themselves. We've turned them into toys that are supposed to occupy us, right? Everything from music to sex to entheogens, hallucinogens. These things are all treated as just sort of something to do. And they're all important, and they all have the potential to profoundly affect you and enhance you. And if you treat them as toys, they won't. So anyway, again, that can sound a little bit like, I'm Captain Buzzkill. It's really not what I'm saying. I hope that you have a life that is full of thrills and joys and, satisfaction. But I hope that they come downstream of the things that are supposed to trigger those sensations, right? So that's a hard message to sell because there are so many competitors selling, like literally selling, junk versions of all of these things. And if you want to live a good life that you can look back on and be happy about, you need to resist the people who are selling you the junk versions, and you need to figure out why you're wired to feel those things and pursue the stuff that's supposed to trigger them.
I think that's a really nice place to end it, actually. And I realize we have run over 2 hours, which you said we were going to do. So thank you so much for your time. This has been a really lovely conversation.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.